Honorable Chair, dear friends and colleagues, thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be part of this conference. The title of my contribution is Continuous Observation for Sustaining Ecosystem Services. Forests provide a huge amount of fundamental ecosystem services as a free gift to all. I believe that continuous observation is indispensable if you want to sustain these services in a changing world. The theme of the conference is biodiversity and ecosystem services in a climate change perspective. Biodiversity represents the wealth of biological resources available to us. A biological system can adapt more easily if its diversity is high. The major threat to biodiversity is deforestation, the destruction of the habitat of many plants and animal species that depend on forests. Ecosystem services refers to the benefits that humans derive from ecosystems. The World Health Organization distinguishes three groups of ecosystem services. Provisioning services, such as the provision of fresh water, food, fuel, and medicine. Regulating services, such as the control of floods, soil erosion, crop pests, and climate. And cultural services, such as spiritual and recreational benefits. The third theme of this conference is climate change. The threats of climate change are manifold, including effects on food production and freshwater resources. Details of numerous scenarios can be found in the internet. Biodiversity, ecosystem services, effects of climate change. Each of these three issues calls for a proper scientific inquiry that starts with a question and follows a plan. In Germany, we had to learn the hard way. During the Middle Ages, many of our natural forests were cleared to feed a growing population and to obtain wood for energy and construction. In 1713, when much of the forest land had been cleared, Hans von Carlowitz published a book in which he mentions the need for sustainable use. He was a miner who needed wood. It took 80 years before Georg Ludwig Hartwig, a scientist, developed a theory of sustainable use. The theory was sound, but he lacked the evidence to fill it with substance. Trees are long-living organisms requiring long periods of observation. It took almost another 100 years before people began to realize that there are no shortcuts. This table shows the data of a field plot that was established in northern Germany during the late 19th century. The plot was remeasured for over 100 years. The table bears witness to an incredible perseverance. They remeasured every 5 years, even during times of war. Such tenacity and determination is hard to believe, but absolutely essential. The design of these early plots is simple, but they provide unique evidence of climate change and pollution effects. Continuous, uninterrupted observation is indispensable for estimating the response of an ecosystem to plant invasion, human disturbance, and climate change. There are no shortcuts. A number of new forest observational networks were established more recently. These initiatives include global and national infrastructures. A prominent example of a global network is CTFS Forest Geo. This network is using very large field plots with a focus on tropical forests. Another example is the Global Forest Biodiversity Initiative, a worldwide research network that includes well over 1 million forest plots. The photos show Rick Condit of CTFS and Jingjing Liang of GFBI. Such global initiatives are extremely valuable, but they lack a legal status that guarantees continuity. National networks may eventually have a greater chance of legal protection and continuity. But until today, these initiatives still depend on the foresight of a few dedicated individuals. This map shows the famous Forest Observational Network of Estonia, one of the Baltic countries in Europe. The network was established by Dr. Andres Kiviste and his team. It covers all the major forest types in Estonia. Another example of a countrywide observational infrastructure is the network maintained by Dr. Javier Corral Rivas and his team in Durango, Mexico. The observational network covers almost all of the forest ecosystems of Mexico. Several teams are constantly in the field, measuring and remeasuring, keeping the huge database up to date, and publishing results that are crucial to the understanding of what affects ecosystem services. During the past 20 years, a large forest observational infrastructure was developed in China by Professor Zhao Xiuhai and his group. The network includes the deciduous forests of the northeast, the pine-oak systems of the north, the tropical forests of the southeast, and the Abies Pizia mountain forest extending from Sichuan to Xinjiang province. An extensive array of studies dealing with effects of forest structure and density and biodiversity on ecosystem services has appeared in leading international journals. Estonia, Mexico, and China are marvelous initiatives that rely on the personal determination and tenacity of individual scientists. But there is no guarantee that the network will survive when the funding dries up or when the individual network champion retires. India is a subcontinent that includes virtually all the major climate zones of the world. Continuous observation of the effects of climate change on the different vegetation types will therefore be of great interest to the international scientific community. I've been invited to India a number of times. In 2011, we established a tree map plot with students at the Institute of Wood Science and Technology in Bangalore. In the same year, another one in the Gibbons Reserve in Jorhat. In 2012, we established several plots in Kailana, near Jodhpur. In 2015, in Shimla, and in 2017 in Dehradun. I had a great time and was impressed by the enthusiasm of the Indian colleagues. At that time, we recommended 3 standard plot types: a small circular plot for covering gradients within a large forest region, a standard 1 hectare plot to facilitate comparison with other regions of the world, and a big 4 hectare plot to assess the effects of scale on competition and diversity. There's been much progress in LiDAR technology for accurate assessment and machine learning for tree species identification. But what we need to know is always the same. We need to know the effects of diversity and effects of density on production. How much carbon does a forest of a given diversity and a given density take out of the atmosphere? A field plot with mapped trees is essential for estimating the diversity of an increasing forest area. The species-area relation helps us to estimate the diversity for different forest areas and thus to study the effects of forest diversity on production. This graph shows the minimum and maximum densities in a natural temperate forest. Estimating maximum density is important because density affects biomass production and thus carbon sequestration. This graph shows quite dramatically the steep rise of biomass production in response to increasing density in a Mexican forest. A small increase in forest density results in a huge increase in forest production and thus carbon sequestration. These are some references to studies that deal with the effects of diversity and density on forest production. The Forest Survey of India maintains a country-wide network of temporary sample plots. When I was in India, we often asked ourselves, what would be a practical way to integrate the temporary sample plots of the FSI and long-term observational infrastructures? The purpose of sampling is to gather, with minimum effort, information about the distribution of a resource. The purpose of observation is to understand ecosystem dynamics, to understand the response to changes in density, diversity, and the climate. Recognizing these fundamental differences will help us to develop practical ways of integrating the sampling schemes of the Forest Survey and the requirements of permanent observation. The need for information is endless. It is useful, therefore, to define the minimum requirements for assessing biodiversity, structure, and density, and their effects on the capacity of a system to capture carbon dioxide, to produce biomass, and to adapt to varying climatic conditions. I recommended 4 basic measurements: the diameter and height of each individual tree, its XY coordinates, and most importantly, the correct species. All else can be estimated based on these 4 parameters. Elaborate installations include roofed experiments, soil and root studies, and canopy crane sites for assessing carbon dioxide concentrations, wind speeds, air humidity, and temperature. These elaborate infrastructures can be very costly, so perhaps such assessments may be left to universities and research institutes, while the state only maintains the basic installations. I want to end this presentation with a personal view. The changing climate requires continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring is costly. Permanent observational installations represent an expensive investment that appreciates in value with each additional remeasurement. The longer the time of uninterrupted observation, the greater is the value of a particular observation site. That sounds like a banality, but it takes effort to convince politicians and administrators of this obvious truism. A special legal protection, for example by Act of Parliament, will ensure that a national asset like a permanent forest monitoring site cannot be abandoned at will after a change of staff. This last slide shows Sankey Tank, our favorite little lake where my wife and I used to exercise before work at the Institute of Wood Science and Technology in Bangalore, and where we used to relax after work. Thank you very much for listening.